Well, I think international capital isn't going to like it, and there may be some harsh reactions. It may be another step towards the gradual fragmentation of the nation-state system in Europe. So other things are happening elsewhere, like Catalonia may have a referendum, and so far it's not clear whether the government will permit it. Certainly the population wants it. And it would be a referendum for a greater degree of autonomy. Something similar might happen in the Basque Country. There are other... Part of the reaction to the centralization of the European Union has been a rise of regionalism and local cultures, local languages, moves towards local autonomy. These are kind of conflicting processes. European Union policies have now been very heavily centralized, so much so that the national governments have virtually abandoned independent socioeconomic policies, handing them over to the Brussels bureaucrats. So this is a natural reaction to it. UK is a little different because they were never totally absorbed into the European Union. So they themselves have kept separate, but now these are further developments. It wouldn't surprise me terribly if something similar happened in Wales. The UK has been kind of a funny construct for a long time. I mean, just what Britain is highly contested. Is it England? Is it collection? Is it a federal collection? Even the so-called English Constitution is, of course, not written Constitution, is very ambiguous about that, and there's a lot of debate about it. But I think it's, the nation state altogether is a pretty artificial construct. Nation states were established almost entirely by violence, and they bring together and they force into a single mold people who often have little to do with one another. They speak different languages, they have different cultures, they have different traditions, different religions, and the effort to mold them into a single entity where they're all subjected to the same fixed national culture and social commitments, service to state power, and so on. That's been pretty hard. Even the effort to establish borders has been a very, very violent process. Europe was the most savage place in the world for centuries while the nation-state system was being imposed. Finally, Europe is now free from internal wars. There's a lot of debate about the reason in the political science literature. I've talked about the democratic peace and so on. My feeling is the basic reason is quite different. The Europeans had to recognize in 1945 that if they ever try to fight another war, they'll just wipe out everything. You can't fight wars with that degree of destructive power in your hands. So therefore it moves to a period of more or less peaceful integration. But if you look around the world, where there are conflicts raging all over the place, virtually all of them have to do with nation-state systems and boundaries that were imposed by the imperial powers, almost everywhere. Let's say take Iraq. The British carved out Iraq in their own interests, not in the interests of the people of the region. And there are sharp differences among them, the Kurds and the Shiites and Sunni and so on. Furthermore, Britain drew the boundaries of Iraq for their own interests. Again, they drew the northern boundaries so that Britain, not Turkey, would be able to exploit the oil resources. They drew the southern boundaries so that Iraq would be almost landlocked. That's why the Principality of Kuwait was separated out. And if you look around, Africa is the same thing, Asia, you know, let's say take Pakistan. The British drew a line called the Durand Line, separating what was India from Afghanistan. Now it separates Pakistan from Afghanistan. The line cuts right through the Pashtun area, and with kind of Pashtunistan. The Pashtun never accepted it. The Afghans never accepted it. Now if people cross that border, we call them terrorists. They may be going home, you know. And the same is true of just about every, take say the US-Mexico border. That was established by a war of aggression in which the US conquered half of Mexico. You take a look at the names of the cities in the southwest and western United States, San Francisco, San Diego, Santa Cruz, I mean, Spanish names. People went, it was a pretty open border for a long time. People went up and back for work, for visiting relatives, cultural reasons, commercial, whatever. The border's been slowly militarized. The sharp increase in militarization was actually in 1994, and that was connected with NAFTA, the so-called free trade agreement. U.S. officials understood perfectly well, and in fact said that the effect of NAFTA will likely be to drive impoverished Mexicans across the border. NAFTA is going to essentially wipe out Mexican agriculture. Mexican campesinos can be perfectly efficient, but they cannot compete with highly subsidized U.S. agribusiness. So they'll be driven off the land. That's still happening. Right now, campesinos are being driven off the land. Well, what do? A lot of them come north, so you get an illegal immigration problem. You have to militarize the border. Things like that are going on all over the world. I mean, I remember it struck me very, not that I didn't know it, but it struck me very dramatically 60 years ago. My wife and I were students. We were living in Israel, and we were kind of hitchhiking, you know, students, backpacks, and we were hitchhiking up in northern Israel. And we were just walking one evening, and a Jeep came along on a road behind us, and the guy got out of the Jeep and started yelling at us, and in Hebrew and told us, you got to come back. What had happened is we'd walked into Lebanon. At that point, the border was unmarked. Now I suppose it's bristling with you know, tanks and so on, but and the border was just artificially drawn right through the Galilee by the British and the French for their own purposes. It had nothing to do with the people there. And all of the same is true almost everywhere. And one of the reactions to all of this is the kind of coalescence of more or less coherent groups, you know, they're never totally so, into regions where they feel more comfortable in running their own affairs. And I think that's pretty much what the Scotland referendum is about. Not simple. I mean, you can't separate yourself from the world these days. Maybe Bhutan can, but most states can't. So Scotland, if it moves towards independence in some form, we don't know what form, would have to figure out ways of determining how it can become enmeshed in the international treaty system. That's not so simple. Like go back a couple hundred years. When the American colonies separated themselves from England, one of their main tasks immediately was to become what was called treaty-worthy, to be treated by the European powers were, of course, the dominant powers, to be treated by the European powers as a nation which could enter into their system. So they had to become treaty worthy of accepting treaties. Now that had a double edge at the time. The colonies, American liberated colonies, wanted it for two reasons. One, to be accepted by the European powers, to be treated, by the international treaties of the day. The other was because the Westphalian system, the reigning system, permitted each state to operate freely without interference in its internal affairs. And for the American colonies, that was extremely important because they had two major tasks. One was to maintain slavery, and the other was to wipe out the indigenous population. And they didn't want interference with that. So if they became treaty worthy, they would be permitted to run their own internal affairs without European interference. And that was not a small point. Like Britain, say, at the time, the major power, was moving towards abolition of slavery, and was moving there. And it had also been protecting the rights of Native Americans. But once the United States became treaty worthy, it was free from those external constraints. It's a little bit like the current international system, which, at least in principle, says you're not allowed to interfere with the affairs of other countries. Like, say, South Africa during the years when it was struggling to maintain apartheid, its claim was, which was not vacuous, was that the UN Charter guarantees that each state can run its own affairs internally. So what does the world have to say about apartheid? That was their argument. It was actually accepted by the legal authorities for a long time. Same. That's nationalism. Has its positive aspects, but it can be very ugly. I don't have to give historical examples. We have plenty of them. Yeah. Well, my guess will be that if there is a move towards autonomy in Scotland, it'll be mild reforms. Nothing's going to be smashed. There'll be slow evolutionary changes in the way Scotland will interact with England, with European Union, with the United States, with international treaties, and capital is sufficiently internationalized, so there's going to be plenty of links and plenty of power. Power won't devolve to the local level. The international financial system is just too powerful for that. So until that's dismantled, all states are going to be enmeshed in the webs that it develops. In the case of the European Union, it's extreme. The Bundesbank and the Brussels bureaucrats are in effect dictating policy for states. Actually, even the Wall Street Journal had an article pointing out that no matter what government wins an election in Europe, communist, fascist, whatever it may be, they follow the same policies. Of course, the policies are not being determined by the countries. In fact, we saw that pretty dramatically when George Papandreou hinted barely that maybe there ought to be a referendum in Greece for people to decide if they wanted to accept the EU policies. And there was just an uproar, furor. How can you ask the people? What do they have to do with it? This stuff is all determined by the bankers and the bureaucrats in Brussels. So it's, without really substantial changes in the international order, any small state, like say in independent Scotland, would have to accommodate itself to that somehow. Well, I read Jim Kilman's comments. I mean, if it's simply withdrawing, it doesn't help much. If it's withdrawing in order to concentrate on other things, which I presume he meant, like developing vigorous social movements which will lay the basis for substantial socioeconomic change. And if withdrawing means let's put our energy into that, then it can be positive. If withdrawing simply means I'll stay home on referendum day, then it doesn't mean anything. Well, first of all, it is very easy to imagine because we live in an alternative to capitalism. I mean, take, say, the big banks, which have enormous power. Where do their wealth and power come from? Well, actually, there was a study by the International Monetary Fund a little while ago of the big banks in the United States. And it determined that their profits almost entirely derive from taxpayers. Their profits trace back to there's a government insurance policy. It's not formal, but it's tacit. It's called too big to fail. It means that if you get in any trouble, the taxpayer will bail you out. That provides the big banks with enormous profits. It's not just the bailouts, the visible bailouts. It means that they get access to cheap credit, they get inflated credit ratings, all sorts of mechanisms which are highly profitable to them. It also means that they can engage in risky transactions which tend to be profitable, and they don't have to worry too much because if it goes wrong, you run cap in hand to the state and they bail you out. Is that capitalism? It's very remote from capitalism. In fact, almost everything you do, say you have a computer, I'm sure you use the internet. Is that a capitalist development? And it was developed in places like this, in fact, right where we're sitting, under Pentagon contracts for decades, before it was handed over to a private enterprise to market. Bill Gates is the richest man in the world, basically he introduced some marketing innovations undoubtedly, but the basic technology and hardware and software, the big ideas, the hard work, was mostly done in the state sector in one or another way, either directly or indirectly in one fashion. And he also has monopoly rights. He managed to get in at a time which grants Microsoft something like monopoly rights for operating systems. Like if you buy a computer, you get Windows. Well, reliance on creative work in the state sector and on monopoly rights is pretty remote from capitalism. We have a kind of a mixed state capitalist system, but it's not capitalism. Can you imagine alternatives to that? It's very easy. Actually, capitalism would be an alternative, but they're much better ones. So, for example, you can easily imagine systems in which, say, the big banks do not maintain their profit and their ability to crash the system because of taxpayer munificence. Easy to imagine. And in fact, there are many other forms of organization, of production, of distribution, and so on, which are in fact being developed. So there are worker-owned enterprises in many places. The old Rust Belt, there are big cooperative, many big cooperative movements in the Atlantic region, in Canada, and many other places. Now, these are all alternatives, germs of another society. Imagining something more free and just is not only not hard, but you can see bits and pieces of it developing. Well, you do what's possible at particular stages of history, under particular circumstances. There's no point, there's no master answer to this. At different times, there are different things to do. There are times when it's possible to introduce a radical change in the society. The most dramatic case was 1936 in Spain, when a large part of Spain was taken over by partially coordinated peasant and worker movements, which created the germs of a left libertarian society. Didn't last long, not because it failed, but because it was crushed by force. The communists, the fascists, and the liberal democracies disagreed on a lot of things, but they agreed on one thing: we have to crush freedom. So the first year of the Spanish Civil War, so-called, was basically a year devoted to crushing the libertarian forces of the left, communists in the lead, but fascists and liberal democracies participating. Orwell wrote about this, not entirely, as he said, he didn't entirely understand what was happening, and there's much extensive work by now, but that's essentially what happened. Well, that was a moment when the circumstances were ripe for a radical change. And it wasn't just out of nothing. There's decades of preparation for it. The preliminary efforts, trials, crushed, rebuild, educational programs. People sort of had in their heads what you could do because of decades of struggle. And that's how things can happen. It happens in other respects, too. Take, say, the American Civil Rights Movement, which was a partial success, not a huge success, but a partial, significant success. The background had been laid for decades of work, most of which got nowhere, or almost nowhere. In 1960, a couple of black students sat in at a lunch counter, arrested. The next day, more students. Pretty soon you had the Freedom Riders, and the formation of SNCC, which was the forefront of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. It was kind of the forefront of the civil rights movement. And pretty soon you had a mass movement, and things changed. It was a moment. It took will and energy and effort, but kind of the time was ripe for it because of work over long periods. And I think that's the way changes take place. I think we comprehended it then and long before. People carrying out a slave revolution understood the nature of power very well. People struggling for their rights everywhere have understood the nature of power. And we still understand it. There's nothing, I don't think there's anything deep and invisible. The structures of power, those we have to unravel. Like, say, the European Union. You want to understand the structure of power in the European Union, you have to understand the way the bureaucracy works, the banks work, the Bundesbank works, and so on. But the nature of power, I don't think that's very obscure. You know. The world's too complex for that. Lots of things are happening. I mean, there's many general comments you can make about them. So, for example, you can talk about the international treaties that are being created and ask what they are. Like right now, there's two huge treaties being negotiated, the Trans-Pacific and Transatlantic Partnership. And you can ask what they are. Actually, you can't really say in detail because they're negotiated in secret. Of course, not entirely in secret. They're not secret from the hundreds of corporate lawyers and lobbyists who are writing them, which tells you what they're going to be, but they're secret from the general population, more or less. But you can study the nature of these, what they're doing. It's been done, good articles in Le Monde Diplomatique and Public Citizen and elsewhere. And when you unravel that, you discover a good deal about the structure of power. You read this morning's newspaper and you find that the US and Japan have failed to impose on their population something that they were trying to do in secret. So far, have failed. Well, all of that can be studied, and but there's no single sort of phrase. I mean, you can make up slogans if you like, but there are no illuminating single phrases that capture the complexity of human life.